Hey everybody, this is Mike Murawski. I am joining you here from Portland, Oregon. I am on the ancestral lands of the Multnomah, Tualatin, Clackamas, Chinooks, Molalla, Kalapuya peoples, and many other tribes that have called this place home since time immemorial. I am, quick visual description, I'm a middle-aged white male. I've got short brown hair. I've got kind of a blue and light red plaid shirt on, and I'm in front of a dark gray wall or a light gray wall that has a map of Oregon and some artworks on it here in my home. Just want to begin by thanking everybody with the Australian Museums and Galleries Association of Victoria for inviting me to be a part of this discussion this morning on future-focused governance and policy with arts institutions, museums, and galleries. Just an honor to be a part of this session, to be with Caroline and Jamie, the other speakers. Just fortunate and grateful to be a part of this and the forum today. I'm going to go ahead and move over to screen sharing. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to join you all live today. And so what I'm going to do is be able to respond to any questions, comments, thoughts, ideas, anything via Twitter on social media. And so I will definitely at the end share my Twitter account. It's Murawski, Murawski 27. And that's on Twitter. Feel free to comment, direct message me. You can definitely reach out to me through other platforms if you follow me there. But I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you have that might come up as I speak here today. And I apologize that I'm not able to be there live, but schedule conflicts happen, and it did in this case. So let me go ahead and screen share and dive into my presentation, and then hope to be able to interact with some of you, during the day today as questions and things pop up. Okay, so the title of my little talk here, and again, really thinking about change, which is something that I think a lot about and I've written a lot about, and museum futures, or the futures of museum and gallery institutions. So I've titled this, "We're All Agents of Change, Shaping a More Human Future for Museums and Galleries." And I really want to focus on the idea that each and every one of us, regardless of our position within these institutions or our work with these institutions and their communities, has a role to play in shaping what I think is a better future for our institutions, and especially as we transition to either out of this pandemic or through different phases of this pandemic. I think this is a really urgent moment for us to be thinking about this. Let me dive in here, see if I can get. So I don't need to go over like too much. We're all extremely familiar with how much we have felt change during this pandemic these last few years, kind of regardless of where you are within the arts world and within or with arts institutions. Change has been dramatic and drastic. So I think we've all sort of felt that, whether it's been through closures of institutions, cancellations of programs, but the way we work has changed, the way we sort of interact has changed, I think. And I believe that you're watching this, most of you are at an in-person gathering there at the conference, which is really, I think, an amazing sign that we're sort of, regaining some of these human connections that we might have lost during this pandemic as we were all separated and separated out. But I think the way that we just interact and gather and connect is just going to be changed sort of permanently, and I think we're feeling that. So for me, change has been a big word, not just during the pandemic, certainly before that, but definitely today, as we sort of better understand our relationship with change. So I begin with a question that I'm going to throw to you all, and I invite you to think about this and reflect on this, even just for a moment now, as you're sort of, sitting where you are or watching where you are. How comfortable are you with change? And I think it's a simple question, but I also don't think we've asked ourselves this question enough as we've experienced all of this change? What is our relationship with change? Have we reflected on that enough? This is even a question, and I've used this sort of scale at the bottom of the slide is definitely an oversimplification for how we can respond to this question. But it's a conversation starter that we can use with ourselves and reflect on this as part of self-inquiry. But we can also bring this to our institutions, to our teams, to our volunteers, to meetings with community members and community partners, as we start to build connections and build trust with each other through the shared experience of change. So I hope you've had at least a little brief moment to think about your own relationship with change here for a moment. And I want to dive into a little bit of what I think the pandemic has exposed, maybe in terms of the relationship that institutions have had with workers, with professionals, with those that are part of these institutions. I believe the pandemic's really exposed a growing gap between institutions and workers in many cases. Of course, this is not an across-the-board statement, but I've just seen and witnessed, and I think we all have, so many institutions that have not been focused necessarily on being people-centered and human-centered throughout the pandemic. And I think it's not something that's new to this moment. I think this happened prior. And so I often say that it has exposed, some of the cracks in the foundation. We've seen a growing lack of trust, a growing lack of equity, a lack of commitment to some core human values and collective well-being that I think are really important. I'm just gonna highlight it because I think if we look back and we really, reconnect with what's been happening these last couple of years through institutions, we start to see evidence of why this lack of trust might exist, why this extremely, especially in the US, this extremely important movement for workers to organize and unionize and really stand up for their rights. Throughout the pandemic, so we've seen museums, and a lot of these examples are going to be, based here in the US where I'm located, but, museums cutting education staff as COVID, pandemic breaks out, arts institutions receiving funds to pay their workers, yet still laying off large proportions of their staff. During all of these budget cuts and crises and layoffs and furloughs, we've seen executive pay increase at many institutions. And I think that has been, not helping in this trust gap. And then at art museums especially, but at a lot of institutions, we've seen endowments soar. Again, while staff has been cut, while executives and leadership refuses to allow staff more benefits, higher pay, the inequities are just increasing. And so these gaps just increase. We've seen this equity gap exist too, with toxic work culture, systemic racism happening and acts of racism within institutions. We've seen, sexual harassment and discrimination happen where workplaces are just, toxic environments for employees. And a lot of the times employees are, acted out against if they bring these to the attention of the board or of leadership. So, out of all this, we've just seen, and only a couple examples here, but we've just seen a massive effort, certainly here within the United States, of workers to come together, to form communities of change, to be dedicated to museums and galleries and arts institutions in such a strong way, and to demand better pay, to demand equitable pay, to demand benefits and parental leave and just better treatment and better workplaces overall. And so we just continue to see this great movement. And unfortunately, we continue to see institutions resist workers organizing and resist these calls for fair pay, fair contracts, and equity. So we do see this gap between institutions and the workers across the board in so many institutions. And so what I want to do is turn to how can we repair these gaps? I think this is also a little bit of how do we not even get into these situations to begin with. For me, that's probably as important as it is to think about how we sort of heal from these moments that we're in now. And so two big questions for me. What would it look like if museums and galleries enacted human-centered change as we shape this future? And what steps can we take to prioritize people, community, and relationships? So as we're building a future-focused governance and policy, as we're thinking about how to sort of emerge from this pandemic, having learned something about what we've experienced, what are some steps we can take to do this better and to build a stronger, better, more human future? Let me turn first to something that I've talked quite a bit about in the last couple of years, and it's really highlighted in my book, Museums as Agents of Change. And this is the idea of a human-centered museum. What is a human-centered museum? For me, this is really foundational. This idea that museums are really a human-centered and a people-centered endeavor. They're not just buildings with collections or exhibits. They are made of people and about people. So this idea, this phrase that I like to use, museums are us. Museums are our communities. And this is an idea that I've loved seeing throughout a lot of the union organizing efforts, that we are the museum. And I think that's the core of a lot of this change activism happening. Here, a silly meme that, that I created and had to share for those of you that remember old movies at least. Okay, so for me, a lot of these ideas were really re-inspired and catalyzed early in the pandemic, right after the pandemic sort of began in the spring of 2020, over 2 years ago, through these words of the managing director of the National Equity Project here in the US, Kathleen Osta. And Kathleen wrote in a piece that was published in April 2020, and I'll read these words, but I've got them up on the screen for you too. How might we use this global crisis to reorder our priorities and live in ways that increase our collective well-being? How might we organize our lives at the interpersonal level and lead change at the institutional and structural level with the awareness that we belong to each other, that every human being is worthy of our attention and care? What might be possible for ourselves and for future generations if we decide to live and lead with this value? And so those words really, they really sort of resonated with me at the beginning of the pandemic, but I've been going back and really reflecting on these ever since. This idea of bringing collective well-being and human care to the center of the work that we're doing. How often do we do that? And what would the future of museums and galleries look like, and our future-focused governance look like, if this is what was driving our decision-making and our thinking? So this human-centered approach, for me, the need has never been greater and never been more urgent than as we emerge from this pandemic or transition to sort of a little bit of a different phase in this pandemic. And I want to kind of look at, for me at least, 5 elements of a human-centered museum to kind of flesh out this definition a little bit. And museum and gallery, interchangeable. I'm really talking just about institutions here. One, I think that's really important, is connecting with human core values. That has been, I think, key. What is driving our work that we're doing? What matters most to us? How do we dig deep into these core human values? And then even like at a personal level, what does that mean to us? And then if our institution could create an environment based on deeper human values, what would that look like? What changes would need to happen in our work for that alignment, that personal core value alignment to happen within our institutions? And a leading thinker on organizational change, Steve Patty, wrote this in his book, Moving Icebergs. He writes, every organization needs to hold candid conversations about values and beliefs, purpose and meaning. And I could not agree more right now. Another key aspect of a human-centered museum is prioritizing relationships. And I think it's been provocative, but also really important to ask questions like, what if we prioritize relationships with people over objects? What if we prioritized communities over collections? And I think we need to think about if that is, if that provokes, a feeling in us, or if we resist that idea, why is that? What if we started to really give a lot more attention to the communities where these objects came from than we did simply just the objects themselves, and change the power dynamics with a lot of the people and communities that I think we should be working for and working with, within museums. Another key aspect of a human-centered museum, and it connects to all of these, of course, is centering community. And I think for me, that is not just this idea of community outreach, which I think has been, the common phrasing for museums for many, many years. This idea that the community is somehow out there and that we need to reach out to it. Instead, I would love for us to think about how we could really bring the community into the center of a museum and acknowledge the assets and the power and the expertise and knowledge that can come from those communities to inform our work and our practice. And up on the screen, I have this great quote from Stacy Marie Garcia, who used to work at the Museum of Art and History in Santa Cruz, and wrote these words through the community center practices that she was leading there. Stacy writes, "It's not solely about how museums can serve communities, but rather what are the community's resources, knowledge, and interests that can inform museum practice. Furthermore, how can museums and communities work together to share strengths in the community?" So just rethinking our relationship with community, I think, can be really important. Rethinking leadership is a really key aspect of a human-centered museum. Oftentimes these hierarchies that exist with museums and galleries really get in the way of us making more human-centered change as we move into the future. So, really thinking about leadership and redefining it. How can leadership be more human? How can leadership mean challenging existing hierarchies, no matter what the size of the organization? How can we think of leadership as being more collaborative, more collective, and a more shared endeavor? It is not a solo thing. That is an extremely outdated model. I think we need to embrace a more collective model of leadership within our institutions and understand that leadership exists everywhere at every level of an organization. What are you doing as you build future-focused governance and policy to really embrace the leaders at every level of your organization? I think that is a really important thing for us to be connecting with as we look into the future. And I think it has a big role to play in how we see equity and sort of the models that we connect with. This incredible report on leadership and race, I have this quote that they said, "We need to move beyond the emphasis on the power of individuals to a philosophy of interdependence and building connections." So I love this idea of really thinking about a much more horizontal model of leadership and hierarchy, and much more relationship-based model of organizational culture. So finally, and definitely not least, practicing community care as an aspect of this human-centered museum. And I bring in two really powerful community organizers and leading thinkers on this idea of how we define community care. Montgomery, it says here, "When we embrace community care, we're centering an architecture of empathy, advocacy, and social responsibility to honor our humanity." And Nikita Valerio, this incredible community organizer, says, "Community care is trusting that your community will have you when you need support and knowing you can be trusted to provide the same." So what do these ideas look like in the practice within museums and galleries? How can we bring these ideas of community care into our work, into our skills, as we build workers for the future, as we build these institutions for the future? How do we value all of this stuff to make our practice more human-centered? Before I move on from this idea, one quick thing is a great question came up as I was making this presentation a few months ago, this idea that a human-centered museum might be in direct conflict with an idea of a planet-centered museum. And I would say that these two are so intertwined and interconnected. All of these things that I'm talking about now lead to a more us thinking more about centering our planet, centering our relationship with, the Earth, with the more than human world, and with the ecosystems around us. So those ideas of care, of rethinking leadership, prioritizing relationships, and connecting with core human values, I believe really does lead to models that are more sustainable and can help us also tackle climate change. And these are things that I'm thinking about a lot more. But I always want to address that too, because this is extremely core to any model that we have moving into the future. So I want to kind of have this little, turning point here with this idea and get back to this idea that we're all agents of change. And one of the inspirations that I have in thinking of this idea is from Octavia Butler, this incredible speculative fiction and science fiction author who wrote a lot of books that sort of predicted and looked into the future, that if a lot of the inequities and climate changes that we see happening now and at the end of the 20th century continued, what would that look like? And her novels have these characters living in these worlds. So at one point at a book talk, someone came up to Octavia Butler and said, "You write about all these problems in the sort of apocalyptic futures, but what is the solution? How do we solve these problems? What's the answer?" And she turned to him and said, and I have the quote up on the screen here, "There's no single answer that will solve all of our future problems. There's no magic bullet. Instead, there are thousands of answers at least, and you can be one of them if you choose to be." And I go back to these words a lot because for me, it is so empowering to think every single one of us has a role to play in solving the problems that we are experiencing now and in the future. And so it's up to us to make change, to really follow through on a lot of these ideas that I'm presenting to you today, and to center care and center equity in the museums and galleries of the future. So I love kind of bringing this idea of Octavia Butler into this talk, and then turning to what do we do? What can we do? We have this responsibility to transform the museums and galleries of the future. So what kind of actions can we take? And for me, I sort of frame this in terms of human-powered change. These aren't necessarily things that one leader at an institution is going to do and enact from the top down. These are more things that we build a community of change around as people, as workers, as human beings, and start to make this change happen tomorrow, today. So I'm going to go through some of these and just highlight these ideas. One, and I've talked about it already, but know what matters most to you. So as an individual, take the time to reflect on your own personal core values, and then think about where it does or does not align in terms of the work that you're doing within the art sector and within museums and galleries. So this is a huge step that I think everyone sometimes skips over, but we need to pause, take a step back, and reconnect with what matters most to us as we do this work. Super important, disrupting, constantly working to disrupt white supremacy, white dominant culture, colonialism, and the status quo. I think for me, recently, I've been framing this in terms of just the challenge that we're faced with to replace the old script, the sort of way that things used to be, the kind of business as usual model, with a new script. With a new way of working that embraces a people-centered model and a lot of these ideas that I'm talking about, and just constantly working against systems of white supremacy and colonialism in the work that we do, which means that this is hard work. This isn't easy stuff. If it were easy, we would have done it by now. And so I think it takes not only strength for us as individuals to do this work, but we've got to work on this collectively. This idea of questioning everything. Too often within institutions, the questioners, the people who question things, are devalued. And I constantly am asking, especially those people in power within institutions, managers and leaders, embrace and value the questioners. We need to slow down and take time and ask these questions of what are we doing? Why are we making these decisions? Why do we keep doing the same thing and expecting different results? So value the questioning and value the idea that we really do push back against things and take time to ask questions. It connects to what I've already talked about, but this idea of centering relationships. How do we start to think about our work in terms of prioritizing the relationships that we're building, the trust that we're building? And that can be relationships within an institution, so relationships with staff, with volunteers, with board members, and it can be relationships with communities. So how are we building those relationships of trust, those long-term sustained relationships? I think is something we can all have a role to play in thinking about. Better understanding our relationship with change. I sort of began this talk with this idea about our comfort with change. And I do think that as we start to shape the future and start to develop better practices, we've got to be constantly taking the time to reflect on what is our relationship with change and how comfortable are we with that. Just a really important step in this entire process. And then finally, I think this idea that I've stressed repeatedly is this idea of this is collective work. We're not in this alone. We have to start connecting with other people, networking with other change makers, building bridges with community stakeholders and community leaders, connecting within our institutions across silos and across department boundaries. Start to build relationships in places where you just don't have them right now, because this work of change is challenging and it's hard, and we can't do it alone. We've got to build a community of change to be able to be successful in pushing forward this work to prioritize people, community, and care. And I want to, I always just sort of end by reconnecting with, again, those words of Octavia Butler, because I really do think we are all agents of change. We all have such a strong role to play in any shaping of the future of these institutions and this sector. I always have, even though there's been a lot of harm, and I, shared a lot of questions and concerns that I have seen happen in the field of museums and galleries over the last several years. I always have a strong faith that we are building, a network of change, and we are making this happen. So I sort of end this with just simply a call, reflecting on these words of Octavia Butler. Choose to be, someone that is helping answer and solve these problems as an individual and as part of a collective, because we can do this. We can actually bring people, care, and community into the center of our practice. If we all, because we're people-centered organizations, if we all commit to it, we can make that change happen. So I leave you with a call to action, to do that, to make that happen, and stop waiting, start removing the barriers. And yeah, I think there's an incredibly bright future for museums that we can envision. I want to end again with this invitation, since I'm not here live, as much as I would absolutely love to take your questions and have conversation, because for me, that's sort of the lifeblood of this work, is being able to be in dialogue and in conversation. So I really do invite you to go onto Twitter either now or at some point during the day, send me a message, could be a comment, but I would love questions, critical thoughts, pushback to any of those ideas. I have learned so much from some of the ideas, questions, and thoughts that people have pushed back on me. I've written a lot about some of those ideas in my book, Museums as Agents of Change. So I encourage you to, grab a copy. You can get it online, hopefully maybe in a library somewhere. You can get a hold of it. That would be awesome. And support local bookstores if you're able to in purchasing a copy. And then finally, I would love to keep in touch and stay connected with you. And I have recently started a Substack community called Agents of Change. And the address is here on the slide, agentsofchange.substack.com. You can sign up for free and just be a part of these conversations about sort of how we can build our relationship with change and start to shape institutions of the future. So thank you again all so much. It's been really a pleasure to be able to present as part of this session. I hope you have an incredible day thinking more about the future and how we can all be a part of changing and shaping the future. And I look forward to seeing your comments and questions on Twitter throughout the day. I will do my best to respond as soon as I can. And thank you all very much. All right, signing out from Portland, Oregon.